Well, good evening, attendees. This is Charles Britton with Community Group. It's a few minutes after 7 p.m., and we're going to get started with our reserve study. This evening, we are so grateful to have our friends with Reserve Advisors with us tonight. And presenting on behalf of Reserve Advisors is Michelle Baldry, and she is going to take us through the what, the how, and the interpretation of the reserve study and the process, and we'll be overviewing with you all great information. As you can appreciate, every 5 years in the Commonwealth of Virginia, we have to do a reserve study for our communities that we manage. And so we look forward to you all having a great evening with Michelle. And there will be a Q&A opportunity. But at this time, Michelle, I'll turn over the program to you. And thank you again for being with us. And we certainly appreciate all of our prospective clients with Community Group, as well as our board members and our employees for participating this evening. Thank you, Michelle. Floor is yours.
Thank you so much. I appreciate the warm introduction, Charles, and thank you everyone for joining us tonight. As Charles mentioned, this is going to kind of cover reserve studies from A to Z. We do want to make sure that you're getting as much out of this as possible. So as you think of questions, please do just drop them in the chat. We'll make sure to answer all of them at the end. Or if you want to just, call them out at the very end, that works too, whatever works best for you. And this will be recorded so we can share the recording. So we're going to jump right in the agenda, what we're going to cover today. First, we're going to talk about reserves. What exactly are reserves? Then we're going to cover what a reserve study is, how the reserve study is facilitated, and then of course, once you receive it, how you should interpret it, how to read it and understand it and utilize it. So what are reserves? When we say reserves, what are we referring to? Ideally, there is a line item in your annual operating budget that is a reserve contribution to that reserve account. And reserve funds are specifically allocated for capital repair or replacement of your common area components. So they're essentially like a savings account. So your operating budget funds lots of annual expenses, probably maybe some landscaping, management fees, insurance, if you have a pool, some pool maintenance or cleaning of a clubhouse or common area. So lots of annual expenditures. But then you're going to have capital components that don't need to be done on an annual basis. Maybe you need to replace your fence every 20 years or modernize your entrance monument or replace the carpet in your hallways. These less frequent expenses are really hard for an annual budget to absorb. So the goal is to have a reserve study conducted where we forecast out those capital expenses. And then ideally, every year you contribute to this reserve account or this savings account. And when the time comes for these capital projects, you pull right from that reserve account. So operating type expenses, usually from an operating account for those annual expenses, and then the reserve fund or reserve account for those less frequent, bigger projects that don't occur annually. So the first step in a reserve study is really determining what the association maintains. The reserve study, similar to your operating budget, is solely focused on the common area components, right? You don't want to fund for things that ultimately the association isn't responsible for. So we are first going to discuss what components are common. And this is usually done prior to preparing the proposal. That's really how we outline the scope of work and prepare a reserve study proposal. I kind of call that the 80 or 90% property description, where we're getting a rough idea of what the association is responsible for. And then that's really ultimately refined when we're out in the field and meeting with you. So the first step is to review those governing documents, get an understanding for what the association is legally responsible for. Unfortunately, we all know those documents aren't always crystal clear. So whenever that is the case, we do recommend that you work with an attorney to seek a legal opinion or interpretation of the documents to fully understand what is common and who's responsible for what. Full disclosure, usually a reserve specialist is more of an engineering type background. All of our reserve specialists do have engineering degrees, so we are not the correct profession to legally interpret those documents. So we do rely on management and the board to help us understand what the association is legally responsible for. And then we're also going to want to understand historical practice. There might be a perimeter fence that a neighboring community is responsible for. However, your association paints your side of the fence. Or maybe there is a component that, let's say the mailboxes, even though USPS owns them, historically, they haven't maintained them quite to the association standard, so the association has taken over ownership of those. That historical practice is something that we'll work with you as during preparation of the reserve study to understand how you guys currently handle those sort of projects. Sometimes you'll hear different terms, common versus limited common elements. So common components are components essentially that the association is responsible for. So the homeowner is not responsible for. So if it's a single family home HOA, usually the homes would be the homeowner responsibility and not commonly maintained, but they might have a common area, say clubhouse or private streets that maybe the association maintains. It's a common component that everyone has access to. Where a limited common component is still typically commonly maintained, it's something the association is responsible for, but the use is limited to one or more, but less than all units. So an example I like to give here might be a balcony. Maybe there's a building with balconies, a mid-rise building where the association does maintain all of those balconies, but the use is usually limited to the unit owner that has direct access to that balcony. So while the association as a whole maintains it, every homeowner doesn't have access to every individual balcony. Now, if it is commonly maintained, whether it's general common or limited common, that is something that should be included in the reserve study, regardless of use access. So what exactly is a reserve study? We've kind of talked through components briefly, but what is a reserve study? Well, CAI, or Community Associations Institute, is sort of the keeper of reserve study standards. They created them, I think it was in the early 90s. They've been revised a couple times, most recently just last year. There were 14 of us throughout the country that worked as a working group with CAI to revise the standards. Historically, where there was a 4-part test, that has been revised to now be called a 3-part test, but it's essentially the same, where this is the first step in really preparing the reserve study is to determine that component inventory. So first step is, as we mentioned, it has to be the association's maintenance responsibility. So it has to be commonly maintained, something the association is responsible for maintaining. Next, it has to have a limited useful life. And what we mean here is it has to be something that we anticipate to occur over the duration of the reserve study. So a typical reserve study is 30 years. So if it's a brand new community, we're going to look at things that have a useful life of 30 years or less. So something with a really long useful life, like maybe subsurface utility pipes, would typically be excluded because they're considered long-lived, meaning we don't anticipate you needing to fund for that project or perform that project during the duration of the reserve study. Another example is a pool. A swimming pool is going to have a lot of components or reserve components that would fall in the reserve expenditure plan. So whether it's replastering the pool or repairing the tiling or the coping or the pool deck or replacing the fence or the pool furniture or the mechanical equipment, right? A lot of capital expenses, a lot of reserve components associated with that pool. But the actual structure itself and the plumbing associated with the pool would be considered long-lived for a brand new community. But as that community ages, eventually that pool structure will fall in that 30-year horizon and then qualify as a reserve expense. Now, this is something that was discussed really heavily as part of the reserve study standard revision, is making sure that reserve study providers are really doing a good job of identifying and calling out those exclusions. So if we are excluding something because it's considered long-lived and not needing to be performed, we need to make sure we're really calling that out and classifying it so that everyone understands that even though they're not funding for this project just yet, it is something that the association's responsible for and something that will eventually happen. The useful life also has to be predictable. And what we mean there is it has to be something that typically needs to be done. So replacement of electrical systems, replacement of a fence, renovation of a clubhouse or an entrance monument, light poles and fixture replacement. These are all things that have a typical useful life and that what we know will need to be done. An example of something that isn't quite predictable is an insurance deductible. We've had associations say, we want to anticipate an insurance claim every 5 years, so please show our deductible as an expense every 5 years. Well, that's not something that we can plan or that we know with certainty will have to be done. And we don't want to underfund reserves. We do want to make sure that you're adequately funded, but we also don't want to overfund reserves. We don't want you funding for things that may or may not happen. So if it's something that we can't readily predict, then it is an exclusion from the reserve study. And then lastly, it has to be above a minimum threshold cost. And the intent here is to really ensure that reserves are intended for these big ticket items, these projects that the budget really can't absorb, right? If it's a small $400 repair, that's more of a general maintenance practice typically, right? As opposed to a capital reserve expense. You don't want to bog the reserve study down with these really small expenses that ultimately really won't impact the funding of the reserve account. So a general rule of thumb that we use is 1% of the budget. So if you have a $200,000 budget, we might set that cutoff at that 1%, which would be $2,000, meaning any expenses below $2,000, general maintenance and operating, any expenses above it would qualify as a reserve expense. Now, that's not a hard line. That is something we would work with you to understand how you operate or how you want to operate and determine that threshold accordingly. But that is something that needs to be prepared and determined as part of preparing the reserve study so that we're all aligned on what qualifies as a reserve expense and what is more general maintenance and operating. So once when we've gone through the 4-part test to determine those reserve components, the reserve study really has 2 main parts. And this is again, right from CAI standards. There's the physical evaluation that is really that on-site inspection where we're developing that 30-year expenditure plan. And then there's the financial analysis. So once we have an understanding of those 30-year expenditures, ultimately, how is the association going to pay for that? What is that ideal reserve contribution to pay for those expenditures that were just outlined? The first step of the physical evaluation is the meeting. There's 2 main portions. There's a meeting and then there's the inspection. So right up front, we want to have a meeting. And what we're going to do during that meeting is really to align, right? That's where we're aligning on that scope of responsibility. So making sure that we're all on the same page with what the association is responsible for maintaining. What are those common area components that the association must maintain? We're also going to want to discuss the history of capital projects. So when did you last repair your streets or paint your buildings or replace the roofs, right? What's gone on at the association? And what planned projects do you have? Maybe there's projects that are upcoming that we should know about and incorporate into the reserve study. If you're planning on a big landscaping project and you're funding it out of reserves, we need to know about that so we can incorporate that into the reserve study. And then we're also going to want to review that operating budget. So we're going to pull out your current year contributions right from the budget. We're going to plug in those actuals and begin our recommendations in the following year. But then we also want to review the budget to align and make sure that we're not double funding for things. We don't want to show expenditures from the reserve account if you indeed fund them out of operating. But we also don't want to assume that you're funding them out of operating when you intend to fund them from reserves. So it's to really kind of create that alignment and make sure we're all on the same page with what the association is responsible for and then how you pay for different projects. After that meeting and we're all aligned on the reserve components, the next step is that inspection. So what is the engineer doing during the inspection? Well, that's where we're evaluating all of those components, right? So we're looking at the condition of the components. What condition is the retaining wall in or the pool furniture? And then based on the materials used, what is the typical useful life that we would usually see? So a timber retaining wall has a different useful life than, say, a masonry retaining wall, right? So what's the life expectancy based on the materials? And then based on the condition, what's the remaining useful life? So if it's in poor condition, something we're going to show near term, or it might be in great condition, and maybe it's at the end of its typical useful life, but ultimately that condition is going to govern. So if there's a fence that typically has a useful life of 15 to 20 years and it's 17 years old and in great condition, we're going to show that replacement timing based on the condition. So we're going to push it out past the typical useful life because the condition warrants that. We're also going to look at the manner of replacement. What makes the most sense here for replacement of these projects? Is it a pretty small community, one small section of fence that makes sense just to do it all at one time? Or is it a really big association with miles and miles of streets and it was built over 10 years? Maybe it's something that we should face and show partial repaving on a less frequent instead of it as one big project, right? Or maybe painting of the buildings. Maybe you're on a regular paint cycle for the buildings. We'd want to make sure we incorporate that into the reserve study. And then lastly, what are the factors that are going to affect the replacement cost? So if you look at two reserve studies, they could be in the same general area, have the same, they both have timber retaining walls. You shouldn't assume that they should have those same costs, right? There's a lot of factors that play into it. What's the size and scope of the job? If it's a pretty small job, it might have a higher unit cost than a much bigger project, right? Just due to things like mobilization. Or what does access look like? If it's a small retaining wall right along the parking area that's really easy to access, much easier job than a really large retaining wall tucked back behind a home along a conservation area where it's really difficult to access and get equipment back there, right? Those are going to have very different costs. So during that inspection, the engineer is evaluating all these things to try and come up with the most realistic replacement cost or capital repair cost possible. After that physical evaluation, after we've aligned on the components, we've measured them, and we've conducted that condition assessment to know the anticipated timing, we've essentially developed that 30-year roadmap of expenditures, right? So the next step is how are we going to pay for it? And the financial analysis is just that, right? A reserve study is a snapshot in time. So you're going to provide us that starting reserve balance. So how much is in the bank today? We've looked at the budget to understand what you're currently contributing to reserves. So we're going to plug in current budgeted contributions for this year. Any planned projects you have for the current year, we're going to show those as well. And then that's going to come up with the projected year-end balance. And then we're going to come up with our recommendations moving forward. So if you have a reserve study prepared this year, your first year of recommendations are probably going to be next year. So we'll show your current budgeted 2024 contribution and begin our recommendation for 2025. And the reserve contributions, it truly is, it's a pretty simple formula where we're just trying to offset the expenditures by how much you have in the bank today, plus those future reserve contributions. So we've outlined the expenditures. You told us how much you have in the bank. So really what we're solving for is those future reserve contributions. So that's ultimately how the reserve study is prepared. But how do you, as a manager or as a board member, really facilitate the reserve study? What is your role in preparation of the reserve study? These are the documents we're really going to want to review ahead of time. So we're going to ask for both a current balance sheet so that we understand your starting reserve balance, and a copy of your current year budget so we can analyze that as well. We're going to ask for those legal documents, so the declaration and bylaws, but again, we know they're not always crystal clear, so we will work with you to make sure that we're all aligned and on the same page with what components are commonly maintained. We're going to ask for the capital project information. So if you've recently completed projects or if you have those planned projects, we want to take a look at those. We want to understand, if you tell us you replaced the life safety system, well, what does that mean? Did you replace all the devices? Were the exit signs replaced? Or was it really just the control panel, really, right? So we want to understand what was done. And same for any planned projects, what you intend to do. We want to make sure that we're capturing all of that in the reserve study. And then lastly, the interest rate. So a reserve study does include both inflation as well as interest that you're earning on that reserve account. So we can either show what you're currently earning, your actual rate of return, or we can come up with a projected rate of return. So we typically use a 3-year CD average for that kind of average interest rate, but we can certainly use your actuals if you'd like us to. Back to that physical evaluation, again, those two main components, both the meeting and the inspection, how do you facilitate those? What does that look like? Well, for the meeting, the duration, it can be as quick as 15 minutes for a really simple association that maybe just has an entrance monument, or it can go for over an hour. If it's, obviously the more complex the community, the older it is, the more active projects you have, it probably will be a more involved meeting, right? There's more to discuss and kind of align on. So that really is customized, but it can be, I would say on average, probably about 30 minutes. But again, if there's more complexity there, if it's an older community with a lot of active projects, could go an hour plus. We'd like that meeting to occur at the very beginning of the day prior to the inspection. So it's important to create that alignment prior to beginning the inspection. And as far as who should attend, really, we defer to you. We want it to be with key stakeholders. So typically management is involved, your community manager, and then any board members or maybe finance committee members that are going to actively use the reserve study. So if you have a finance committee and they're actively involved, it might make sense to involve them. Or maybe the treasurer, it's going to kind of keep the reserve study current. Anyone that's really going to utilize it and be a stakeholder in it, we want them to be part of it and make sure they understand it and contribute to the development of it. And it could be someone with a lot of historical knowledge. Maybe it's a new community manager and a new board, and you don't have a lot of that historical information, but you know there's a homeowner that's lived there, for the last 15 years. They're often really helpful to provide some of that historical perspective, right? And it's really great to have all of the key stakeholders there to hear the information and to align and all agree on some of these assumptions. During that meeting, we really welcome questions and concerns. If you have a concern with the playground or a concern with maybe some of the railings at the sidewalks, we want to know about it. Make sure you're bringing those to our attention so that we can all review them and make sure that it's accurately incorporated in the reserve study. And of course, there's no dumb question. So ask your questions. We want to make sure that you feel very comfortable and confident in the reserve study and have the ability to read it and understand it on the back end too. So we welcome that, and we'll spend as much time necessary to make sure that we're all aligned and on the same page. So after that meeting, again, we have the inspection. So how do you facilitate the inspection? It's really helpful to notify residents and homeowners prior to the inspection occurring. Sometimes homeowners get a little nervous when they see us walking around, taking notes and snapping photos around their community. We're in their backyards or, at the pool and things like that. So it's really helpful if they have an understanding that there will be someone inspecting the property. We usually wear our logos and have business cards, so we're happy to explain what we're doing and who we are. But the more heads up that residents have, the better. We do welcome board involvement in the initial part of the inspection. So if you want to show us some of those areas of concern, maybe there's a bridge on the walking path that's pretty difficult to find and you want to make sure we see that, or you want to show us those railings you were concerned about or that area in the playground, we welcome that. So right after we conclude the meeting, let's go to those areas and put eyes on them together so that we're all aligned on them. But we do ask that we provide the engineer some time to independently inspect the community. During that inspection, they're not only trying to quantify all of the components, but they're also conducting that condition assessment to analyze when these projects should typically occur and then determine the typical useful life as well. So it's really important that they have their full attention dedicated to that inspection. So we ask to kind of work with the board or management early on, go to those areas of concern, then we'll free you on your day and allow the engineer the time and dedication they need to really ensure that they're providing that quality inspection. After that, your commitment and participation in the reserve study is really done. Now the engineer has to go back to the office, they crunch the numbers, they put together the report, they present it to quality assurance. I can't say all companies do, but we certainly do have a quality assurance department. So you're not just getting the one engineer's opinion, you're getting our internal quality assurance team to review it, align on those recommendations, and ultimately sign off, give it the reserve advisor's kind of seal of approval prior to you receiving the study. So when everyone's aligned, the reserve study comes. Well, how do you interpret it? How do you read it? How do you utilize it? So there's typically four main portions of a reserve study. There's going to be an executive summary that's pretty concise, has a lot of high-level detail. Then there's that expenditure plan that was developed during that physical evaluation. Then the funding plan, so how you're going to pay for those projects that was developed, that financial analysis. And then lastly, the report narrative. So that's more information, details around those expenditures. Not all reserve studies are the same. The format certainly looks different, but all reserve studies should have these four main sections, and I'll kind of quickly walk you through them. I'm someone that is a little more visual, and I like to kind of see things to understand them, so I'll walk you through what ours looks like. And again, this isn't to say that they'll all look like this, but they should have some of the same relative detail. So executive summary is just that, right? Those high level details. What are the property basics? How many units? When was it built? When was the inspection? What is the funding goal? So what ultimately drove the funding recommendations? What's our critical year and what's driving our funding? What projects should we prioritize? This is a little unique to us where we've developed a kind of 5-year priority schedule. And the thought here is that we do want to make sure that you're funding for these components that we anticipate over the duration of the reserve study, which is 30 years. You want to have funds available for those longer duration projects, like maybe a roof replacement. We want to gradually fund for those, but we really want to call out those expenditures that we anticipate to occur over the next 5 years to really get them on your radar. And the thought there is Virginia does require reserve studies every 5 years. So it's kind of between now and the next reserve study, which projects should we really focus on? Which projects are we seeing that are these near-term needs that should be a priority for you? I should point out the law does not require you to follow the the recommendations. So just because a reserve study says, if we're anticipating you're going to need to replace your pool furniture in 3 years, and 3 years comes and your pool furniture is still in fine condition, you are not legally required to replace your furniture. The goal is just to make sure that you have the funds available when you do need to do that, right? So if when you need to now replace it the following year, the funds are available for that project. Lastly, in that executive summary, we're also going to, of course, include that recommended reserve funding. So what does that mean? What is the change from our current reserve contributions to what we ultimately need to be contributing to reserves? What should that reserve contribution be? Next up, the expenditure spreadsheets. Now, the detail that's included is fairly typical, but the way it's presented is often very different. So I can show you ours. This is a sample expenditure plan. This is the way we categorize ours, or what our layout looks like. But the information, any reserve study will have the inventory, right? What are the common area components that qualify as a reserve expense? Every reserve expense will be quantified. So what's the square footage of the balconies or the square yardage of the pavement? Every component is going to have a useful life. So how often we typically would estimate for this project. So replacement every 20 years or maybe 15 to 20 years. Every reserve study should have a condition assessment where we're determining when you're going to need to do the project. And then every reserve study is going to have a cost, right? So a unit cost, how much does each light fixture cost, or a project cost? When you need to paint all of the buildings, what is the cost that's anticipated, right? So all of that information should be included in any reserve study. It's just the way that's presented will look different. So I do encourage you to review sample reports and ultimately find a layout that you're comfortable with and that's easy for you to utilize. The expenditure sheet should have inflation. So everything is priced out in today's dollars, but we do want to make sure that we are including inflation in there. So if it's a project that we're not anticipating to be done for another 10 years, we're going to price it out in today's dollars, but that inflation is going to compound. So when you see the project actually spelled out in 2034, it's going to be reflective of that inflation rate. So based on that expenditure plan, we're now going to put together a funding recommendation. There are a couple different funding methodologies. Component method does just that, where you're funding for each component individually. That's pretty rare. We see that in Florida more often than in any other area of the country. Almost always in Virginia, we see associations with pooled reserves or one big reserve account. And so that typically is the cash flow methodology. So that's the methodology we use. Now, when we look at your balance sheet, we see that you have 5 different reserve accounts. We're going to talk through that, because if you do have these segregated reserve accounts, then we should set the reserve study up accordingly. But if you have one big general reserve fund, we're going to show the cash flow methodology. So we're going to start with that beginning reserve balance. You're providing that to us, how much you have in reserves today. Like I mentioned, the current year, it is going to be all budgeted information. So you're going to give us what you currently budgeted for in reserves. We're going to show that interest earned. Any planned projects you have, we're going to show those to come up with that projected year-end balance, which then becomes the following year's starting balance. And that's where our recommendations would begin. And it truly is money in, money out. So this is the starting year balance. We're going to add those anticipated contributions. We're going to add the interest. We're going to subtract out expenses to come up with a projected year-end balance. And it truly is, that's what we do for 30 years. And what we're looking for is really ultimately what's driving the reserve funding is finding that critical year. So in this instance, The reserve study does cover 30 years, but they have a couple years here from 2023 to 2026 where they're spending about $1 million. So they're draining that reserve account down to 2026, where their reserve study started at about $500,000. You can see 467,000. They're going to keep contributing, but they're spending as well. So in that critical year, we have them down to $64,000. And this is where it's a little bit more of an art than a science. There's no hard rule around this where we're going to ensure that all associations have the same amount of reserves in that critical year. It is where we kind of analyze the association, analyze the size of it, their funding methodologies, to come up with a threshold or kind of factor of safety there, like a little cushion, to not bring reserves down to zero. Bringing right down to zero is called baseline funding. And that really doesn't provide any flexibility. So if something slightly more than was anticipated or occurs ahead of schedule, you don't have the wiggle room there, and essentially we'll have to special assess. So most reserve studies will include some sort of threshold, and that's really something that's determined after we understand the expenditures and the needs of the association. This is the graphical form of that funding plan. I really like this graph. It's included right in our executive summary, and I always include or encourage clients to share this, especially at maybe an annual meeting time. And maybe there's questions about the reserves and why we have all this money sitting in the account. I really think this graph helps homeowners understand the importance of reserves. The blue line here is the reserve balance. The green bars are the reserve contributions, and the red bars are the reserve expenditures. So if the reserve account didn't exist, that whole top half of the graph wouldn't exist. You'd essentially have these fluctuations in your budget, right? Where years where you don't need to perform any capital projects, and then years where you have these really big projects and you'd have to special assess or take a loan out. Really, really difficult for management to manage your association, for boards to manage the association, and then certainly for homeowners to manage their finances, right? It's really unstable and unpredictable. So the goal here is to stabilize that contribution. Now, we don't want you to contribute the same amount on day 0 as on day 30, just like we know costs are going to inflate over time. So should your contribution, right? So we're going to show that same inflation that we showed on the expense side. We're going to show that on the contribution side as well. So that's why the contribution goes up over time. But it's really easy for an association to say, we have $600,000 in the bank. We're looking around and everything looks pretty good. Our insurance just went up a ton. We want to cut from reserves. We don't want the budget to go up. We want to keep dues stable. So instead of contributing to reserves, let's cut that reserve contribution. This helps explain why you can't do that, right? Even though you have a few years where you're contributing more than you're spending, everything's in relatively good condition, and you're continuing to grow that reserve account, it's absolutely essential because in just a few years, you have these years where you're spending a ton more than you're contributing, right? You're really draining that reserve account. And that's necessary because if you didn't increase those contributions or continue to fund reserves in those early on years, you'd have a shortfall. You wouldn't have those necessary funds. But then it's also easy for a homeowner to say, wow, okay, we got through all these big projects. Now we can decrease that reserve account, right? We just need to get through these critical years. Then we can stop contributing to reserves. Well, that's why the reserve study really has to go out a good 30 years to understand the whole holistic picture and needs of the association. It's important to not just stop funding reserves. You have to continue to contribute to that reserve account, grow that reserve account, because out there in 2043, you're spending a ton of money. You have a lot of years where you're spending much more than you're contributing, right? So this helps them understand not only what reserves are and the importance of it, but the immediate impact and why the dues need to be where they are today. And lastly, of course, there's the narrative section. Now, I honestly believe that this is the section that is most different between different providers. There's some reserve studies that have very, very minimal narrative sections. And then there's some that have much more detailed. This is a snippet of ours, but again, I really encourage you to compare sample reports to ultimately find a report that's easy for you to read, to understand, and ultimately utilize. In our narratives, this is really where you go to find out what's going on in that expenditure plan. So you see a line item or an expense for painting of the siding. Well, what does that mean, right? And 3 years from now, when you go to paint the buildings and you're wondering the costs are way different than what the reserve study said, this is where you can understand what the associate or what the reserve specialist anticipated was going to need to be done. And this ultimately should be determined based on that meeting and discussion where we're really aligning on that scope of work, right? So in this instance, you can see, of course, we have painting of the siding, but then we're also including wood railing painting and wood column painting, but we didn't include the soffit and fascia because that's aluminum and doesn't need to be painted, right? So this is where all of that is really, really defined and explained. We're going to capture that history so that the association has a living document, kind of snapshot in time of when projects were done and the condition that was observed. So what we saw at the time of the inspection, and every component will have photographs. So we're not going to say something's in poor condition and needs to be done next year without explaining what we saw, right? This is where you can go to see that detail. We're also going to educate the board on some of these more complex projects, right? When you see fiber cement siding and people talk about the flashing or the trim or the sheathing, what does that mean? We'll have graphs where applicable or details or schematics to help understand some of the more complex components. So maybe it's siding, maybe it's roofs or painting, right? To really understand what the components are and the best way to maintain them. So what did we include in this expenditure, right? This is where you go, okay, well, we included painting of the siding. It also included the garage doors. We included 2% partial replacements, knowing that there will be some that fail. We included 10% of the trim replacement, and then we also included sealants, so replacing up to 50% of the sealants, right? So this is where you go to get that detailed understanding of what is assumed to be done. And that's not to say this is a crystal ball and exactly what's going to need to be done, but it at least provides perspective on the strategy or the thought at the time when the reserve study was prepared. There might be a line item for an HVAC system, and you're wondering, well, is that just the air handler? Is that the condensing unit or the heat pump? What's all included? Again, the narrative section is where to go to get an understanding of the assumptions at that time. And lastly, the reserve study isn't something that you just want to have done every 5 years and you look at it when it's done and then it's kind of shelved for 5 years. It really should be something that's reviewed and kind of monitored on an annual basis, right? So as you enter the next fiscal year, what are those priority projects that were identified? Let's look through those projects and are they something that we need to do or are we going to defer it a year? But it's important to make sure that we're not forgetting about it entirely, right? If we're choosing to defer it, if it's something we don't think we need to do right now, let's make sure we keep it on our radar. Let's move it out from 2024 to 2025, but make sure that as we enter the 2025 fiscal year, that is something we're evaluating again and making sure that we're keeping it on our radar. Now, of course, if the reserve study has gone too far sideways, where maybe you had a bunch of unplanned expenditures or so maybe there was a bad storm that came through and a bunch of hail damage to the roofs, and that had to be done ahead of schedule. If you've gone too far from what the reserve study recommended, it is a good idea to get it professionally updated to get the reserves back on track. And of course, utilize your reserve specialist. This is what we do day in and day out. We field these calls all the time. I was on with a couple different clients today that called and said, these are some of the things we're doing. Do you think we need to update it? And in some instances, it was like, no, I think that's fine. Go ahead and do those minor replacements or repairs. You're still relatively on track, all not noted in our system, and we'll catch it as part of the next update. Or, wow, yeah, this was a big change. This wasn't something that was anticipated, needed to be done. You've added this new component that we were unaware of, or that the association didn't maintain at the time. So we should update the reserve study to incorporate that expense. So that's something where you review it annually, and then refer back to your reserve specialist when you have questions about it. We are a resource. It should be a partnership. It's a service. There's collaboration. It's more of a consulting partnership than it is a product. And then here's my information. We are happy to answer any questions anytime. There is no dumb question. Melissa Yoakum, who's also on the call, can also be reached at the same phone number too. So we do want to be a resource for you and make sure that reserves is something that you understand and can utilize.
Michelle, thank you so very much. I just noticed in the chat that there was a question, so I'd love to raise it right now just to see what you think and can offer to the group. So the question is, if the roads are private within a community and maintained by the HOA, would this be a part of the reserve study? And if so, what typically would be included in that
Absolutely.
description?
Yes. So if the streets are private and the association is responsible for maintaining them, then they certainly should be included in the reserve study. So in your operating budget, you might have maybe snow removal of those streets, right? And so that would be a general maintenance or an operating expense. And the reserve study would focus on those capital repair and replacement projects. So typically for streets, we would have a line item for periodic crack repair and patching. So that is more of that capital maintenance type expense where you would usually do that, say, every 3 to 5 years, but it's a pretty big cost, right? So that would usually qualify as a reserve expense. And then we'd also have the eventual repaving. So depending on the age and condition, it might be a mill and an overlay, or it might be a total replacement. If it's a really old pavement in really bad shape, you might need to completely dig out the base and completely replace the pavement. And that ultimately, how that project would need to be performed goes back to that inspection. That's where we're really analyzing the condition to determine what is the most appropriate way to maintain that pavement. If there's curbs, we would usually show partial replacement of those curbs. It's really rare for concrete to completely fail all at the same time. So based on the condition, we'll have partial replacements of the curbs. If there's catch basins or inlets for the stormwater, we'd have capital repairs to those, and that's usually tied with the pavement. And then if the sidewalks are private, we'll usually show partial replacements of the sidewalks as well. And then I think there was one other question. Was it stated that a reserve study should be performed every 5 years? That is a great question. So Virginia does require reserve studies to be conducted at least every 5 years. So 5 years is really the maximum that they should be performed. But when the standards, CAI's reserve study standards were revised, they did determine that the best practice is to update reserve studies every 3 years. So the new best practice is every 3, but the maximum is every 5. What I tell clients in Virginia is to really make sure you are reviewing it annually, right? And if at year 3, things have gone relatively according to plan and there haven't been any hiccups, it's probably okay to defer it, right? Just reconsider it again at year 4. Are things going according to plan? If so, then you're probably fine to do it at the 5-year mark. But if it's gone sideways, then you might want to update sooner than that.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Michelle. And one other question. Typically, when a board makes a decision on who they wish to utilize for their reserve study. And let's just say that they assume that they're going to be going with reserve advisors. Is the initial contact between the engineer and the manager assigned to that particular property, or is it that they will work with the boards? How have you seen it in your experiences?
Great question. And ultimately, this is a service that the association is embarking on, and we defer to you on that, on what's most appropriate. So I can tell you, usually, it's the manager, the community manager that we work with to gather some of that information, to coordinate the inspection, and then the manager will invite the board to attend that meeting and contribute to the preparation of the reserve study. But sometimes it's the board that reaches out, requests the proposal, is the lead throughout the entire process. That really is customized. We can do it however makes the most sense, however the association usually operates. But more often than not, it is the community manager that is sort of the lead and facilitator and kind of coordinator.
Excellent. Thank you for the in-depth overview. I don't see any other questions in the chat. Let me just double check again and make sure. I think we're all righty. Well, Michelle, thank you so very much. Your expertise tonight was first class. We really appreciate you and your team at Reserve Advisors giving us a nice overview of what to expect and questions to ask and how to be even more informed about this adventure that boards get to go on every 3 to 5 years. So thank you so very much for that. And really, on behalf of Community Group, we really appreciate you spending time with us. And to all that attended this evening, thank you for giving us a portion of your evening. And certainly, if you have any questions at all, Michelle's contact information is right there on the screen. And certainly, we at Community Group are more than happy to offer our counsel as well. So with that, everyone, please have a great rest of your evening. Thank you again to our presenters this evening, and we wish you guys all the very best. Take care.
Thank you so much, Charles. Thank you, everyone. We really appreciate your time. And thank you, Community Group, for organizing this. This was really nice, Charles. It's so fantastic when management companies give back to their associations and offer this sort of education. So thank you so much. We're honored to be a part of it.
Oh, we appreciate that. Absolutely. Take care. We'll see ya.
Thank you.
Thanks so much.
It's just us.